Tonight at 10, a sweeping government reshuffle as Boris Johnson sets the tone for the years ahead. Gavin Williamson is sacked as Education Secretary, widely criticised for his handling of school exams in England.
Are you still Foreign Secretary, Mr Raab?
Dominic Raab is removed from the Foreign Office. He becomes Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. And Liz Truss becomes only the second woman in British history to take charge of the Foreign Office.
The Prime Minister has put in place a strong and united team, which is going to deliver for the United Kingdom. We're determined to deliver on the people's priorities.
A new pecking order, new faces and a new phase as Boris Johnson refreshes his team.
Yes, more from Laura in a short while about the political direction laid down by today's changes. Also tonight, Shamima Begum, who left the UK to join the Islamic State group, now offers to help the UK's fight against terrorism. A report from one of Afghanistan's biggest cities on how Taliban rule is having a profound effect on everyday life. And 14 goals in a thrilling night of Champions League football.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, former Open champion Henrik Stenson is named as the final captain for Europe's Ryder Cup campaign, which begins in Wisconsin next week.
Good evening. Boris Johnson has reshuffled his government, making far more radical changes than many had expected, and set the government's direction with a view to the next election. He's fired his education, justice and housing secretaries and demoted others as he reshapes his senior team. Dominic Raab is no longer Foreign Secretary. He's Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, with Liz Truss becoming only the second woman in UK history to hold the post of Foreign Secretary. Gavin Williamson, widely criticised for his handling of school exams in England, has been sacked as Education Secretary and he leaves the government. Mr Williamson has been replaced by the former Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi. We'll have details of all the main changes, while Labour says that the reshuffle does nothing to change government policy on the main problems facing the UK, including poverty and inequality. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg has been watching the day's events.
Nerves all round.
Who's out? Who's in, Prime Minister?
Reshuffles matter. Who the boss wants in and who the boss wants out. Prime Minister's questions came first.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions.
Eager to congratulate a sporting victor.
I know that the whole House will want to join me in congratulating Emma Raducanu.
But today's real query, who'd be a winner and who'd lose one of their front row seats. To start, where would he end up?
Are we going the wrong way?
The black belt Brexiteer Foreign Secretary, who was in charge from his Grecian holiday during the fall of Kabul. Dominic Raab down but not out. After lengthy conversations, perhaps a dollop of confrontation.
Have you still got a job, sir?
The former lawyer moves to take charge of the courts and prisons at the Justice Department. It's not clear if Number 10 had bargained on giving him the bauble of Deputy Prime Minister too. But he emerged with that, a title that's not been held since 2015.
Are you expecting a promotion?
His replacement, Liz Truss, much loved by Tory members, moving up into her fifth job at the Cabinet table.
Well, the Prime Minister has put in place a strong and united team, which is going to deliver for the United Kingdom. We're determined to deliver on the people's priorities and help level up the country.
But time waits for no minister. For a quartet of the Cabinet, the clock ran down on their time in office. Robert was an unlucky name today. Robert Jenrick from Housing and Robert Buckland from Justice, both out. But spared the shame of a sacking in Downing Street, their own statements on social media sufficed. Along with the predicted departure of the now former Education Secretary Gavin Williamson.
Yeah, I sort of have to do quite a few tests.
Who many would claim failed rather a lot of those tests. In charge of confusion over exam grades and millions of school pupils during the pandemic. Taking his place, Nadhim Zahawi, with a huge thumbs up from Downing Street after overseeing the vaccine programme. Promotion for him to the Education Department. Nadine Dorries, a best-selling author and inhabitant of the celebrity jungle, has triumphed in this wild terrain. promoted to look after culture and sport. Both Nadine and Nadeem, seen here, are loyal long-term backers of Mr Johnson. Watch their upset back in 2016 when their wannabe leader pulled out of his first bid for number 10. And other fellow travellers are at the top table too.
This is a really fantastic challenge that Prime Minister has set me, and I'm looking forward to it very much.
A grinning Michael Gove with a job technically less senior, now in charge of housing, councils and the union. But Downing Street wants this to be a day for the doers. The top rank round here, who number 10 hopes can get things done. A day of many moves, a day when political fortunes rise and fall. And Huw, there are still appointments coming through tonight, and there will be through much of tomorrow as the middle and junior ranks of the government get filled up. You know, clearly in terms of the personnel, there are a lot of winners and losers tonight, and this isn't just been a reshuffle of tweaking around the edges. But nor has Boris Johnson chucked out the kitchen sink. You know, the Chancellor is still there, the Home Secretary is still there, the Health Secretary is still there. And it's also not a reshuffle that suddenly gives the impression that Downing Street is seized of a brand new philosophy or a brand new ideology. Now, for many of Boris Johnson's backers and in number 10, they say that's a good thing. He's pragmatic. He wants people in there who can crack on, who can help him keep the long list of promises that he's made to the public. But for some of his detractors in the Tory party, they might look at this list of names that's come out today and will continue into tomorrow and think, well, what's the guiding principle here? What is the one or two priorities that Prime Minister really has? But for number 10, they believe they've put together a refreshed team. Now, the traumas of Brexit and those early times of Boris Johnson in office are in the rear-view mirror. Now, the emergency of the pandemic is, everyone hopes, also fading. It's the beginning, perhaps, for Boris Johnson of a third part as Prime Minister, and perhaps edging towards the halfway of what he hopes will be the first term in office, maybe with an eye on the next election. But of course, as with all of these things, as with all of these days of promotion, demotion, and quite often a lot of political commotion, whatever ministers say, whatever Downing Street says, it's a lot easier to say than actually do.
Laura, many thanks once again. Laura Kinsberg there with her analysis at Westminster. Now, there's been a sharp rise in the cost of living. The soaring costs of transport and eating out in August helped to push inflation to its highest level in nearly a decade. It rose from 2% in July to 3.2% last month. Our economics editor Faisal Islam has more details.
Not since 2012 has the rate of price increases reached this level, and the month-to-month increase is unprecedented. Yet for the traders at this Manchester market, it comes as no surprise at all.
Well, it's no wonder it's a hike in inflation. The import costs and the cost of bringing containers through is massive. The petrol has jumped diesel prices, so it's costing hundreds of pounds extra a week to transport the goods, and the public are the people that will suffer.
It's the fact that food costs in restaurants and pubs are much higher now than last August, when the Chancellor's Eat Out to Help Out scheme halved some meal prices that pushed today's inflation number above 3%. On top of that now, pub landlords say prices will go up further, reflecting the need to pay staff more.
They need to have a decent living wage, which is what we as a business have started to do. And of course that is going to have a knock-on effect on how profitable our business is. And whereas we're happy to, take a slice of the pie, our slice, and give it away and share it with our staff, at some point, some of that pie is going to have to come from the customer as well.
Beyond restaurant meals, prices rose at the petrol pump, up 17.7% on the year. Second-hand car prices are up 18.3% as demand for cars surges, and furniture prices, affected by blockages to global supply chains, are up 8%. Cooking oil prices are up 5.4%, meaning overall food prices are now rising after falling for most of the pandemic.
Well, there clearly are many one-off factors coming from the lifting of lockdown, the turn in food prices up, the coming rise in energy prices next month, and the increase in taxation means that the squeeze on living standards in households is very real indeed. That's one of the reasons why the assumption here at the Bank of England that inflation rise is going to be temporary, well, that's being tested.
That rise in cooking oil prices puts it at a 30-year high, and alongside surges in cardboard and plastic prices, will feed through to ordinary consumers, says this distributor.
Clearly we can't keep absorbing them forever, so I anticipate that there will be some price increases before Christmas, but it will really hit after Christmas. So that's when it's going to really take effect on our customers anyway. But I do know of some competitors that have increased prices right across the board already.
If forecasts are right, this hike in prices will be reversed next year. But the squeeze on the cost of living this winter is very real. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
Well, as that reshuffle was going on earlier today, the House of Commons was debating proposals to scrap the £20 a week increase to universal credit. It was introduced last March to help during the pandemic. Ministers say that increase was always going to be temporary, but Labour says it really should stay. Our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan, has the story.
£20 a week is a fortune for those on a low income, like Caroline Rice, a childminder from County Fermanagh. She says there's little left for her to cut from her weekly outgoings.
I'm just living from one payment to the next payment. If my washing machine breaks down, I have nothing to repair it. If my car breaks down, I have nothing to repair it. Potentially I could run out of oil, and I don't have a surplus. I have no savings.
The mother of one says she can't earn more. The law limits how many children she can care for, and she can't make the parents she works with pay for hours they don't need.
The reality is that it is a lifeline for so many people, and there's quite a high proportion of us are working people, and it keeps me going. It keeps my child fed. I'd like to see the government live, the life that we live.
To strengthen the safety net, say the Chancellor, an extra £20 a week was added to universal credit in March 2020. It costs £6 billion a year. The number of people on universal credit almost doubled during the pandemic, peaking at just under 6 million. Despite the economy improving, the latest statistics show that nearly 5.9 million people are still on the benefit. In the Commons today, the government's decision to cut what they always said was a temporary increase led to some pointed exchanges.
A single parent could be a constituent working on the minimum wage, already working full-time, would need to work over 9 hours a week on top of their full-time job just to get the money back that the Prime Minister had taken away from them.
Under this government, for the first time in decades, wages are rising, Mr. Speaker. Wages across the board are rising, and they're 4.1% up on where they were before the pandemic. In fact,
Today's parliamentary debate changed few minds. The government abstained. So next month, nearly 6 million people will see their income fall by £20 a week, just as energy prices are set to rise. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
Let's take a look at the latest official figures on the pandemic. They show there were 30,597 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means an average of just under 32,000 new cases per day in the past week. There were 8,340 people in hospital yesterday. 201 deaths were reported of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And so the average number of deaths per day in the past week is now 139. Looking at vaccinations, 89.2% of people aged 16 or over in the UK have had their first vaccination, and 81.3% are now double vaccinated. Shamima Begum, who left the UK as a teenager to join the Islamic State group in Syria, has begged to be allowed to return to the UK, insisting that she could help in the fight against terror. The 22-year-old, who's been living in a Syrian refugee camp for the past 2 years since her British citizenship was revoked, claimed that she had been groomed to flee to Syria as an impressionable child. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford, takes up the story.
This was Shamima Begum in February 2019 as she emerged from the collapse of the Islamic State group's brutal rule in Syria. She told BBC News that weekend that she could see justification for the Manchester Arena bombing as retaliation for the deaths of children in IS territory. This is Shamima Begum in her latest BBC interview, her hair uncovered, and asking for forgiveness for joining Islamic State.
ISIS ruined people's lives. ISIS ruined my life, my family's life. you know, and I will have to live with that.
I mean, when you think back to being part of a group that did commit genocide, that did murder, that did carry out attacks around the world, how does that feel?
It makes me sick to my stomach, really. It makes me hate myself.
Shamima Begum had left home in East London aged 15 with 2 school friends. They travelled through Turkey to Syria and married Islamic State fighters. At the time, IS were beheading hostages and throwing gay men from high buildings. She was stripped of her UK citizenship because of intelligence about what she'd done during her time with IS. The decision to take away Shamima Begum's British citizenship was made by Sajid Javid when he was in charge here at the Home Office. Today, he said of the intelligence that he saw at the time, "If you knew what I knew, you would have made exactly the same decision." Shamima Begum is still in a camp in Kurdish-held territory. Her 3 young children, by an IS fighter, all died of malnutrition and disease as Islamic State's so-called caliphate collapsed. Now she's offering to help prevent other girls being groomed by extremists, despite herself being regarded as a threat to national security.
I could advise people who work in counterterrorism the tactics that groups like ISIS use to persuade people to come here, and ways to speak to people who may be potentially radicalized, and ways to speak to them to persuade them not to go and to not be radical.
Brutality of ISIS before you left.
Presenting the image of a modern British woman, she wants to win her citizenship back. But the current Home Secretary is still vigorously opposing that in the courts. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, at the Home Office.
Now, this evening, Britain, the United States and Australia have launched a new defence and security partnership to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines for the Australian Navy. The leaders made a joint address, it's happened in the past few minutes, to announce the details of the agreement. So let's talk to our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. What have they been saying, Jonathan?
Well, British officials say this is a very significant agreement, I think reinforced by the fact that you've got the 3 leaders of these countries making this announcement simultaneously. It is about, essentially, for starters, building a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines for the Australian Navy. We're not sure how that work will be shared out, but clearly the British government hopes that British defence firms will benefit from that. They have expertise in that area. It'll have ramifications for 2 specific countries. First of all, France, a NATO ally, which had signed a deal with Australia to build them a fleet of diesel-electric submarines. That deal now seems dead, so their nose will be out of joint. But also, more importantly, perhaps, China. Now, the government here says it's not a response to any one country, but about the security stability of the region. And the fact is that we know, it's no secret, that both Australia, the UK and also the United States are very worried about China's military build-up in the region. I mean, that's one reason why, for example, at the moment, you have a Royal Navy aircraft carrier in the Pacific, HMS Queen Elizabeth, with the task group there. So I think the key here is how will China respond? And you can be pretty sure they will not welcome this.
OK, Jonathan, once again, many thanks. Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent there. Now, it is exactly a month since the Taliban swept to power in Afghanistan and declared the country an Islamic emirate. As the international community grapples with the scale and the extent of the change, how are things changing in Afghanistan under Taliban rule? Our correspondent Sekunda Kamani and camera journalist Malik Mudassir sent this report from one of Afghanistan's largest cities, Mazar-e-Sharif.
Crossing into the Islamic Emirate, a cargo train from Uzbekistan. This is now passport control. The Taliban even have their own stamps. An hour's drive away, the city of Mazar-e-Sharif. On the surface, life appears to be continuing as normal, though many are suffering with a shortage of cash in banks. This was the Blue Mosque, the city's cultural heart, shortly before the Taliban takeover last month. Now the group have allocated separate visiting times for men and women. Some are still coming, but there seem significantly fewer than before.
Especially in these big cities.
My host here is a leading local Taliban figure, Haji Hekmat. Your critics would say you're killing off the cultural life in this country.
نه فرهنګ خو مو فرهنګ ته مونږ وده ورکړې اسلامي فرهنګ هغه دغسې ګډوډي اختلاط نه خوښوي نو لهذا مونږ فرهنګ را ژوندی کړ.
And why do you need to change the culture? What's wrong about the culture that was already here? Everyone was Muslim.
که غربي نړۍ راله 20 کاله دلته هغې تبلیغات 50 کالو پورې تقریبا 40 کالو 50 کالو پورې دا ملک د یو لاس نه بل لاس راولېدلی دی په یو لاس نه دی پاتې سوی خامخا دې کې مونږ ډېر عنعنات ورکړي دي او ډېر کمی بیشې سوی دی.
We literally just came out of the Blue Mosque and saw a crowd gathered in the city centre. We made our way to the middle of it and there are 4 dead bodies laid out here. One of them has a note on top of it saying, "These men were kidnappers. Anyone who wants to do the same, this is going to be their punishment." All around me there's a huge crowd of people trying to push their way forward to have a look at the site. A group of young children were rescued by the Taliban from the kidnappers. Many praised the group for tackling violent crime that had plagued major cities. But many others here don't feel safe. Private universities like this one have reopened. Female and male students are separated by a curtain as per new Taliban rules. But with money tight and the future unclear, only a handful are turning up.
هیچ احساس امنیت نمیکنم. من هر دقیقه از خانه میبرایم. هر دقیقه که هر طالب را تایر میبینم من از ترس تمام جانم میلرزد.
How does it feel studying but not knowing whether you'll be able to work or not in the future?
ما کلا امیدمون را دست دادیم. یعنی ما فقط کوشش داریم که با آینده خوشبین باشیم.
The last time the Taliban were in power, they imposed even more restrictions. But however they may have evolved since then, Afghan cities have changed much more. The Taliban control the country, but still need to win hearts and minds. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Mazar-e-Sharif.
The US Olympic gymnast Simone Biles has accused the FBI of turning a blind eye to the sexual abuse that she and other athletes suffered at the hands of their team doctor. She was among a number of people testifying before a Senate committee examining the agency's investigation into Larry Nassar, who is serving a life sentence for sexually assaulting girls.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse.
Was Simone Biles giving evidence to that Senate committee today. Now, the voters of Russia go to the polls this week to elect a new parliament. The vote will take place over 3 days, and that's more than enough time, according to the critics, for the results to be rigged in favour of Vladimir Putin's supporters. The Russian authorities insist that the election will be free and fair. But it's been preceded by an unprecedented crackdown on dissent, and many Kremlin critics have been prevented from running, as our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg tells us.
The Veterans Choir of Novosibirsk is gearing up for a special performance. They'll be entertaining voters at polling stations. Elections in Russia are quite a show, but not everyone's invited. Sergei Boyko isn't. The Novosibirsk city councillor and YouTube host wanted to run for parliament, but because of his links to jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny, under a new law, Sergei's barred from elections for 5 years.
Is there any real opposition on the ballot?
No. For example, I could not participate, my friends could not participate, any people linked with Alexei Navalny could not participate, so it's not the election.
On paper, at least, voters will have a choice. But critics say all the parties on the ballot have been vetted by the Kremlin. Approved opponents, staged managed democracy. As for the Kremlin's fiercest rivals, they're being kept at a distance. Dmitry Gudkov is an opposition politician who's fled to Bulgaria. His problems in Russia began when he said he was going to stand for parliament. Police detained him. Then he received a message. If he didn't leave the country, he'd be sent to jail.
To what extent has democracy been destroyed in Russia?
100%. Everything is destroyed. No more democracy in the country. It's a dictatorship. A light version.
But in Russia, ask officials about democracy and about who can and can't run in elections, and they'll paint a very different picture.
Our restrictions are in the interest of society and the state. Democracy isn't absolute freedom. It's about order and procedure. Our elections are absolutely democratic, even more democratic than in other countries.
The right to elect and be elected is the basis of democracy. But these elections suggest that in Russia, democracy is in retreat. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Novosibirsk.
Some football news. It's been a thrilling night in the opening Champions League fixtures for Manchester City and Liverpool. They both won with 14 goals between the two matches, as Natalie Perks tells us.
The Liverpool faithful finally back for European nights at Anfield. Absence certainly makes the heart grow fonder. AC Milan have had an absence of their own though, 7 years out of the Champions League till now, but it looked like it was going to be a baptism of fire with an early own goal. It could have got worse, but Mo Salah missed a chance to double Liverpool's lead.
And it's saved.
And it was a let-off that let Milan back in the game.
And it goes now to Rebic, and they've equalised.
With Klopp left scratching his head, Liverpool's dominance soon gave way to downright sloppiness.
But it's going to be put in by Diaz.
A half-time pep talk was needed. It clearly worked. First Salah, then Jordan Henderson to complete another memorable comeback against Milan. 3-2, the final score. Manchester City came so close to landing the trophy its owners covet the most last season, and Nathan Ake got them off to a dream start against Leipzig.
Massive moment.
But the game caught fire, and at 3-2, Jack Grealish showed just why City paid a record fee for him. A hat-trick for Leipzig. Nkunku made it 4-3, but late goals for Cancelo and Jesus made it 6-3 City on a captivating night in the Champions League. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
And that's it for now. Here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.